Okay, sorry.
It's just, you just click this button.
The right button.
This. Yeah, you're on the screen now.
Okay, very good. So, first of all, thanks to René. Fantastic work that you have set this up. These preceding months, I've seen with my own eyes something coming from nothing to this thing. Thank you so much. Now, I'm supposed to talk about drug policy and human rights, and I have subtitled it, Why are restrictives letting legalizers dominate the strongest argument? And I'm going to explain what this strongest argument is. But first, a slide with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon meeting with the Global Commission on Drug Policy in 2011, only after a few months of the existence of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. The immediate reach that you can have if you have a billionaire organized legalization NGO, which I refer to as a bongo. And for those of you who have studied law, international law, you might be familiar with the expression gongo, which was in textbooks in the 1990s. And that referred to a government-organized, non-governmental organization, which was being much fund made of by human rights activists. The same human rights activists that are now financed through billionaire organized organizations. So, here we have the picture. We have the Secretary General here, Ban Ki-moon at that time. Here we have Richard Branson, who is the originator of Global Commission on Drugs. And this is 2011, so 8 years before, he set up another organization which was called let me think now what it was called. It was called the Elders. And the Elders comprised of Desmond Tutu, former Finnish President Matti Ahtisaari, and I think 3 other people. And they were supposed to give important advice in international relations as being the elders. And they were converging on his private paradise island in the Caribbean, Necker Island, where you also have film stars hanging out. So it's kind of it's very attractive environment. Barack Obama went there immediately after their finish as president and was kind of water scooting together with Richard Branson. So this is the kind of connection you can make if you have a lot of money and a paradise island. And here stands in the middle then Ban Ki-moon. To the left of him stands 2 former presidents of Latin America, whom I was not aware that they had any involvement with drug policy before. They hadn't written or said anything substantial on the matter. And they're holding up this banner, End the War on Drugs. The whole thing looks like the Secretary General, he wants to end the war on drugs, whatever that is, whatever is the definition of the war on drugs, which he hasn't defined himself. So this creates like a strange situation, and also the name of this organization. It's not called like World Federation Against Drugs, you all know. That sounds like an NGO name, a kind of ambitious and pompous NGO name, but nonetheless an NGO name. Here you get unclear, is this a UN body or is this something else? What exactly is the Global Commission on Drugs? And these people are not members, they're commissioners, these Latin American presidents. We're going to come back with some other slides later on Global Commission. So, my name is Stephan Dahlgren. I have written a book called The Protection of Children from Illicit Use of Drugs, a minimum human rights standards, a child-centered or a user-centered drug policy, and I think especially the later is important, and you're going to see it soon. I have been Child Protection Officer and Head of Child Protection for UNICEF, working in New York, Lusaka in Zambia, and Kathmandu in Nepal. And I have been focal point for human rights as United Nations Development Group Office in New York. Here's the cover of our book. You can find it on the net if you Google my name. It's about 150 pages long. It's a challenging read because it's quite academic. You'll have to look at it. Or, yeah. So what I want to highlight in this presentation is strategic communication problems for restrictive NGOs, CMD 2009 to 2025. I want to highlight that human rights is actually your strongest argument. I want to highlight that a serious human rights argument means what it means. Human rights is not what you feel, but it's what in the treaty text. And finally, I want to highlight how UN agencies have been overtaken by deliberately legally incorrect rhetoric from billionaire organized NGOs, what I call bongos, and what to do about this situation. So I start with civil society, and this might be a divisive picture, but that's not the purpose. The purpose I'm putting this up with Greta Thunberg, who is at this picture 15 years old. She's very engaged in the environment. What she's analyzed and what she concluded might be right or wrong, I don't know, because I'm no expert on environment. But what I wanted to show here is she is out herself at this age, and she became very internationally famous, but she started herself outside the parliament in Sweden with a school strike for the climate. And then it went on to there, and eventually she wound up in the UN and all kind of places. And she was initially taken with curious kindness by other people, but eventually she kind of attacked like she was an adult. She kind of viciously attacks on her message, and it's a fair game, but she stood up, and she was 15 years old. So the issue I'm trying to say with this, here you have a civil society organization with a purpose, a goal, an own analysis, and not hiding. And that I consider is a problem on our side, because restrictives has been hiding, has lacked analysis, and has been unwilling to engage in debate. 2005 CND, legalizer side meetings. We have numerous legalizer side meetings, and this has been going on for at least 10 years. And the side meetings that they're having is probably 5 times as many as restrictives is having, if not more. In these meetings, the legalizers have high-level flag bearers, so they have Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, the Pompidou Group, they have many member states, they're sitting all at the podium. It looks very impressive. It looks like the whole world is thinking like this. They have concrete outputs. They have recently done guidelines on human rights and drug policy, which we'll come back to. And they have a consistent narrative also. Harm reduction equals human rights, stop the war on drugs, evidence-based policies, etc., etc. This I contrast with restrictive side meetings. Far fewer restrictive side meetings. I don't think this is a problem, because the reason the legalizers is having so many side meetings is that they have a lot of money. It's lower level and quantity of participation on the restrictive side meetings. Also not a problem, because of the same reason. You probably can get this higher level of participation, etc., with money and kind of time to convince people to be there. The problems I see is, in comparison to Greta Thunberg, no discernible narrative. I don't know, through various countries, what is the narrative today to counter drugs. Examples of themes being taken up when the house is burning, because here the house is burning. You have the narrative from the legalizers that it is a human rights violation to have a restricted drug policy. There is no counter-narrative to this. So this central narrative means that the whole restrictive policy is being put into question on human rights basis. And instead we are responding with side meetings like innovations in care, new findings on cannabis legalization, and an interesting project on Iceland. And this has been the case for like the last 10 or 15 years. There is no policy conclusions that's supposed to impact on UN policies, like these guidelines I just mentioned on human rights and drug policy. So I'm going to go now into an analysis on the legal part. I'm going to talk about treaties and what they say, standard interpretation of international law, and the issue about harm reduction activists as human rights advocates, which is often being proposed. So firstly, when we talk about international drug policy, then we're talking about the 3 UN conventions on drugs, 61, 71 and 88. When we talk about international human rights, we're talking about like issues like torture, women's rights, racial discrimination. We are legally talking about the 9 UN conventions on human rights and their provisions. The importance of conventions is that these are legally binding. And there are minimum standards, and they are hard law, contrary to declarations, papers, theories, jurisprudence, etc., which are at best soft law. So here's a screenshot from the web page of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the 9 conventions. I don't know how to scroll this, but okay, it doesn't matter. So there is one on civil and political rights, social and cultural rights, women's rights, torture, children's rights, migrant workers, enforced disappearance, disability. Only one of these conventions is talking about drugs in one provision. All other conventions, which has between 10 and 40 articles, is not talking about drugs, and that is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So what does it mean then when you have only one of conventions talking about illicit drugs? What is the significance of this? This means that Article 33 of CRC is lex specialis on drug policy. And this is something that you learn in the first months in law school. You have this kind of Roman expression, lex specialis derogat lex generalis, and then you have that the newer law is derogating older law, which is very logical. So if you have a law that specifically targets something, that's the first port of call where you go in order to assess what is the legal situation that you have to deal with. So the starting point for any international or national drug strategy must be children's right to protection from drugs. Any suggestion that starts with a right to harm reduction or stop the war on drugs makes no sense as per international law methodology. That is like talking about enhanced interrogation when the issue is torture. In this context, right to health or right to privacy are lex generalis, and thereby secondary or tertiary consideration in comparison to right to protection. And I will illustrate this more with other special protection provisions in the CRC. Before coming to that, I'm going to briefly go into CRC Article 3, which is one of the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's called the best interest of the child article, and some people use this quite frivolous to proclaim that anything is in the best interest of the child. You can make an argument for things that seems very far-fetched, like female circumcision would be in the best interest of the child, despite all the rest of what's being said in CRC. This is not how it's supposed to be used. CRC Article 33 is supposed to be based on what is said in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the policy shall be child-centered. This is the message. Child-centered means that the first question the policymaker should ask is, what is in the best interest of children? And in this particular case, the question that should be asked is how to protect children from any drug use. A child-centered strategy starts with the explicit right of the child, not with secondary rights to health or non-legislated rights such as suggested harm reduction, etc. So right to protection goes before right to health of an adult drug user. The text of Article 33 is this one. I shall not read the whole text, but you see there I highlighted some parts. We should protect children from the illicit use of drugs and from involvement in production and trafficking. Three things. As in the middle also, it says, as defined in the relevant international treaties. So here you have a reference directly to the drug treaties, and this is what we proposed in our book 2012. Later, the legalizers, who actually one of them wrote a PhD in this topic, he had to acknowledge that this was actually the case, that this part of Article 33 is indeed referencing the UN Drug Convention. So there you have a link between human rights and drug conventions. So drug conventions wouldn't by themselves be human rights, but thanks to this link, they become a human right. So the claim is then, drug conventions are part of CRC Article 33, and the drug conventions is part of the human rights canon. Then I go to the drug conventions, who are often vilified by people who want to legalize or decriminalize, and let me say, that is the same thing. Decriminalization is de facto legalization. It's like something that remains illegal, but you're supposed to do nothing about it. So it's no more impressive that you decriminalize than you legalize. So the preamble of the 1988 Drug Convention is saying that they're concerned that children are used for illicit drug consumption, so the same as you have in CRC, and also illicit production, distribution and trade. The two other things that you have in CRC. So it's identical, basically, this preamble with what is being said in CRC. And it also says we should eliminate the root causes, including the illicit demand for drugs. This is the legal framework that is being set out, and I think this is quite clearly underlining that what we're aiming for is a drug-free society. And Article 3.2 goes even further and makes it absolutely clear we shall establish as a criminal offense the possession for personal consumption of drugs. So this is a minimum human rights standard that you do this criminalization. Anything else, you're failing to live up to CRC Article 33. And I told you before I was going to give a little context with the other CRC articles. So we have a section in CRC which all the articles are talking about protection. Article 32 is talking about protection from exploitative child labor. 34, protection from sexual exploitation. 35, protection of trafficking of children. 37, protection from torture, and 38, protection from recruitment to armed forces. Now, when I worked at UNICEF, I didn't work with drug policy. I worked with Article 32, exploitative child labor, and Article 34, sexual exploitation. I was sent on country missions to make assessments and propose programs for countries on this. So that means the first thing I had to do was to analyze objectively what are you supposed to be doing? What is kind of the minimum standard you're supposed to live up to here? And in my briefs that I wrote for UNICEF, I wrote that what you have to do is, firstly, that you have to take legal action against these things. You have to set up some kind of preventive standards. Then you have to do a number of other things after that. So that it would be strange if Article 33 would be treated differently than all these other special protection articles. In 2008, UNICEF is issuing a renewed child protection strategy. I was part of the team who wrote the first, but I was totally junior then at UNICEF, and I had never written or seen a strategy before, so I was more like a note-taker back in 1995. And that strategy we did in 95, that was, I think, a little bit sketchy. But 2008, they had more experience at UNICEF, and I think they came up with general ground rules that makes total sense. So child protection should be guided by existing international normative framework. That means on drugs, CRC Article 33, and not unlegislated concepts such as harm reduction. 2, we shall create a protective environment that minimizes child vulnerability. Well, that means a drug-free society. 3, successful child protection begins with prevention. This is UNICEF's proclamation. And prevention entails legislation and enforcement. For any other of these articles that I had before here, nobody would have a contestation on any part of what UNICEF is saying there. But Article 33, by some corners, are actually attacked in a different way. So the policy shall protect children and be child-centered. The policy should not be centered on the adult user. So here I took an example about drunk driving. We have legislation in most countries on drunk driving. It criminalizes drunk driving. You get a punishment if you're driving drunk. Now, if you are the drunk driver, the adult person, assumingly who is driving drunk, you might kill yourself. You might get injured because it's not a very good situation to be in a car and driving it not with your full faculties. But that is not the primary consideration. The health of the drunk driver is not the primary consideration. It's the health of the third party that is the primary consideration, the safety of the third party. And it's strange that there is proclamations to the drug policy should work to the different, that we actually should prioritize the health and the interests of the drug user ahead of the third party, codependents, wives, families, etc. So summary, child protection is lex specialis, health or privacy is lex generalis, and harm reduction or stop the war on drugs is neither of the above. Key protagonists of drug legalization are generally referring to drug law reformers as human rights advocates. This you will find in The Guardian and other newspapers which are on this side of the fence. And a real human rights advocate is rather someone who is insisting that all human rights have to be upheld exactly as written in human rights treaties. And I'm coming here to think, and perhaps people will not agree with me, but until I have further evidence to the contrary, I think Edward Snowden seemed to be, to me, a person who actually stood up for his belief and the letter of the law to the point that he actually got himself lifetime exposed from his own country. And this is what the human rights advocate should be. Maybe some evidence is going to come up to the contrary later, but so far I haven't seen any. So drug law reformers are rather activists for something that collides with human rights. Okay, how does harm reduction comply with human rights? Because I think we should do this question before we get into next. UNAIDS is earlier defining, there are two definitions we could find when we wrote the book. One was from UNAIDS, and that was a very limited definition which basically concerned services to opiate injectors. So a very limited group of drug users in very high risk, and many probably already addicts and in kind of danger of losing their lives. But that seems to have been overpassed, I think, in the debate in recent years on how this expression is being used. And instead, the most spread definition now, but also then, is Harm Reduction International's versions. So I put that up. That definition has principles and goals. The principles is respect the right of people who use drugs. Avoid stigma of people who use drugs. This is the important things that you're supposed to be doing. Abstinence from drug use is an individual's choice and should not be imposed. Harm reduction is policies that aims to reduce health consequences without necessarily reducing drug consumption. This is how they're defining harm reduction. And so, with a very lenient way of analyzing this, I would say harm reduction is at best reactive, it's not preventive. Harm reduction makes the adult user the victim, the recreational user, instead of the child. And harm reduction is illogically promoting lex generalis over lex specialis. In summary, harm reduction goes against human rights and drug convention. Harm reduction is a human rights violation if you analyze it legally. Second part of presentation, legalization and NGOs elaboration on human rights and drug policy. When we wrote our book, we Googled, we didn't know who was really active in this field. So we Googled the net for organization, NGOs involved with human rights and drug policy. We got up a lot of hits. I think we looked at 40 initially. We sorted it down to 20 by some criteria, geographic spread, and how much they had written and so forth. And the key ones here were Open Society, Human Rights Watch, which is financed by Open Society, Global Commission on Drug Policy, and International Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy. They all promoted the same arguments and terminology, like they had been having workshops with each other. And this was also observed in a book by the researcher Sal Takahashi, a former employee of INCB and also deputy head of office of High Commissioner of Human Rights. And he wrote the book in 2016. Almost all NGOs we looked at, I think 17 out of 20 were financed by Open Society. The more we read, the clearer it became that just a few people were the brains behind the human rights argument. And these two people were Damon Barrett and Rick Lyons. They had the organizations together, Harm Reduction International and International Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy. Among those two, Barrett was the key man since he was the only one addressing CRC Article 33. We followed the writings from 2008 to 2018. And I'm going to give you a summary here in order to give you the feeling of how they have analyzed and approached the issue of human rights and drug policy to do with, and now finally the stone dropped. As I will demonstrate later, there doesn't exist any competency on human rights and drug policy at the UN. So this is a one-way traffic that is taking place there with these bongos who are promoting their ideas and their kind of warped interpretation of international law and human rights. Okay, then we go over to the third and final part of the presentation, United Nations. I just want to give you some context here. Some of the important agencies is High Commission of Human Rights, 1,300 staff, headquarters in Geneva, UNODC, 2,500 staff, headquarters in Vienna, UNICEF, 14,000 staff and headquarters in New York, and WHO, 8,000 staff and headquarters in Geneva. It's not like they're lacking means, the UN agencies, for setting aside one person to deal with the issue of human rights and drug policy, at least one of these agencies. And I'm saying this as I've worked for United Nations, and I'm a convinced fan of United Nations. My heart lifts when I come down on First Avenue in New York and see the scraper there. It's like, this is a sign of enlightenment. But I'm appalled by how they have handled this question. So, I take a screenshot here, and I circle a person, and that person is the head of UNAIDS. And the screenshot is from the website of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So you see that now Branson has managed to enroll even more people. More people like to come to Necker Island. So you have there the former president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, and George Shultz. And George Shultz, I still give it to him because that I remember from the 1980s when he was sitting in Ronald Reagan's government. And that was a very strongly anti-drug government that the United States had at that time. But George Shultz had some kind of background as libertarian, and Reagan tolerated his views if kind of kept them private as far as he understood. He was articulated and outspoken on favoring kind of legalization of drugs at that time. Now, if you really have that conviction, you probably haven't been bought. So I will actually credit George Shultz that he probably represented his own opinions. I'm much less clear on others if they represented their own opinions or if they get paid by Branson for doing what they promoted. Okay, so we go to Moscow in 2009. And you had a meeting there with the Russians where Mikhail Sideby, this executive director who became a member of the Global Commission, was taking place. So Sideby is saying the following in the meeting: let me be clear about the United Nations position on drug use. We are completely against drug use and legalization of drugs. We consider it's the duty of each country to prevent its population from starting drug use and to fight illicit drug trafficking. And he also saying that harm reduction has nothing to do with legalization. Harm reduction is a set of services. He is met the next day or immediately by a violent rebuttal from legalization organizations. So 6 of them are getting together to write this letter. Among them are Open Society, IDPC, and a bunch of others. And they're saying in the letter the following: on the issue of UN being completely against drug and legalization of drugs, it's to our knowledge without basis in UN policy and seems inconsistent with the philosophy of harm reduction that you alluded to in your speech. Harm reduction recognizes that many people either cannot or will not stop using drugs and therefore seeks to minimize the harms related to drug use. It prioritizes protection of the dignity and health of people who use drugs over effort to prohibit all use, user-centered policy. By contrast, your statement comes dangerously close to stigmatizing all people who use drugs as a population that the United Nations is against. Damn right, United Nations is against it if you look at the treaties. So, rounding off this letter with a threat of loss of funding for UNAIDS, because they also have connection into this global fund phrase that existed at that time. And Sideby gets quite stressed by this. So the next day he's writing a 3-page reply. And I can only describe the tone in this reply and the structure of it as growing. And he's writing there, it's important to make clear the distinction between decriminalization of drug use and legalization of illicit use. I want to underline that UNAIDS is unequivocal in our call for decriminalization of people who use drugs. So what does this mean? It means that Sideby is making a 180-degree logical U-turn from UN being totally against drugs and drug use for prevention to being totally for decriminalization of personal drug use. Given the non-coordination between the speech and the reply from Sideby, it also seems that UNAIDS have no in-house expertise on human rights and drug policy. Let's go to the next agency, High Commission of Human Rights. Another picture from Global Commission's website. Louise Arbour, circle in the middle, she's the former High Commissioner for Human Rights. To the left of her you have the now deceased Kofi Annan, and to the right you have Pavel Ben, Mayor of Prague. So Branson is successfully continuing to recruit people. The OHR positions, I'm going to look at some of the positions to 2009, 2015, and 2019. In 2009, which was the year before we started writing our books, so we only read it in 2010, Navi Pillay, who was then the High Commissioner for Human Rights, made a press statement before the UNGAS 2009. And in that she's critiquing state for underemphasizing harm reduction and human rights. She's asserting that harm reduction is the most effective way of protecting human rights. Navi Pillay provided in her short press statement no definition of harm reduction. She provided no analysis on human rights or reflection on children's rights. So how did she conclude that harm reduction equals human rights? Roxana and I, we contacted High Commissioner of Human Rights, and we asked for an interview with their expert on human rights and drug policy in 2010. We got no written answers. After reminders, a lower-level person from High Commissioner called us up and informed that drug policy is not a priority for High Commissioner, and therefore there is no in-house expert on drug policy, on human rights, or paper on the same thing. So Navi Pillay said what she said without any basis, except for possibly external lobbying, and we have to guess where that is coming from. Then we move some years ahead, October 2015. High Commissioner chaired a Human Rights Council meeting on human rights and drug policy. Sitting on the podium with High Commissioner were Global Commission on Drug Policy and IDPC, so obviously they now kind of moved up a bit in the rankings. High Commissioner fronted up a decriminalization narrative. CRC Article 33 was ignored. So again, we wrote to High Commissioner and asking to interview their expert on human rights and drug policy. They seemed puzzled by this question at first. We were talking to the kind of press person, but after a while they shook up the name Robert Husbands, and he was supposed to be the one we should talk to. So initially, High Commissioner agreed in writing to do a written interview. And then we sent our questions, and when they saw the questions about children's rights, they withdrew. Their explanation was, we did not expect this type of questions. And they wrote to us. We asked them if we could reformulate them to meet their expectations, whatever those expectations were. High Commissioner did not reply to this at all. Then I move over to 2019, where I, for the second and last time so far, have been going to the CND. And I'm there meeting with a self-proclaimed High Commissioner focal point on human rights and drugs, Sabed Mahmoud. This is how he introduced himself to me. So I asked him, can I ask you some question about children's rights and drugs? And initially it was okay, but when I had asked the question, then he said, I'm not a child rights specialist, and if you wanted that we should be highlighted, we should speak to UNICEF. Now logically, any human rights issue is being handled by the High Commissioner. And he redefined his task now as doing practical advice on how to help drug users. That was his task, not to kind of follow up on the treaties that they're managing. Could we please? Thank you. So conclusion of UNHCR 2009 to 24. They seem to have no in-house expertise on human rights and drug policy. They are in verbatim saying that legalizations and what the legalizations NGOs are saying. And human rights and drug policy have been seemingly outsourced to bongos by High Commissioner. Are these bongos also instrumental in High Commissioner refusing us interviews? Because if they don't have the in-house capacity and they get these questions and they use them to sit at the podium with them, it's not a far-fetched idea that they actually send our questions to these organizations. And that, I think, if that should be the case, it's a bit of a commendation for our questions, because that means not even these bongos with the 50 lawyers, because they do have lawyers. Human Rights Watch has many lawyers. Not even them can answer our questions. So the strategy is not to answer this at all. That would be kind of an interesting point. And then, is this still on? Do you hear? Oh, okay. UNODC. UNODC has the direct mandate on drugs, as you know. And now I took a screenshot from Essex University, which is where all the experts on the legalization side has migrated. On top there you have the one I mentioned before, Rick Limes, who was head of several organizations. And in the middle I circled in is Stephen Mulby, who was working at UNODC when we were interviewing them. So, UNODC was the only agency when we wrote our book who had issued papers on human rights and drug policy. Both were undersigned by Executive Director Antonio Costa at that time. And I'm going to look at the second paper. It's not so different from the first. It was 22 pages long, and it has 11 paragraphs addressed to the right of health for drug users. 10 paragraphs talk about the right to due process. 9 paragraphs talk about criminal proceedings and sentencing. 1 paragraph talk about children's rights, and only for children who use drugs. So adult users' rights outnumber children's protection rights 30-1 in this paper. All children who do not use drugs are excluded by UNODC in favor of those who use drugs. And so this is a political rather than a legal proposal. Then we went to meet UNODC in 2010, and credit to UNODC, we actually got the meeting, contrary to High Commissioner and others. And we're meeting then with their expert in this field, and that was Stephen Malby, who was in this screenshot I showed you before from SH University. And we noted in the meeting with Malby that the logic, language and reference in UNODC's paper seemed to be exactly mirroring legalization organizations, namely the papers from Beckley Foundation and the ICHPD paper. So we asked, so were they involved in drafting this? Because this is such an unorthodox methodology that you have applied that it would be totally unlikely that anyone could do it independently, the same thing. And then Malby opacly denied ICHPD authorship. He's suggesting though that one of the legalizer authors, Barrett, had indeed been around, but nobody at UNODC had listened to him. We asked Malby why CRC Article 33 was not featured in the papers. His answer mirrored the legalizer suggestion. It is not clear. So here we got our chance, because here comes the kind of crunch question. Okay, so let's say Article 33 is not clear, which is completely not true, but let's say it's not clear. So which article in CRC do you consider is clearer than Article 33? And then Malby is thinking for a while, and he's saying, the one about double jeopardy. There exists no such article in CRC at all. So then we asked Malby, because he wanted that courts should decide what a CRC Article 33 means. We asked him if it's okay for a state or a UN body to sit on their hands waiting for court decision on each article in a UN instrument, as this means that no implementation will ever start. Malby had no answer to that question. So what we can say about UNODC is there exists no identified in-house expertise at UNODC on human rights and drug policy, and UNODC paper must have been written by outsiders. And here, my new friend Gary, he actually was at the CND this year, and he contacted UNODC, and they kind of sidetracked this question. They didn't give a name of a person that they had, but they were going to get back and possibly have a kind of video conversation later. I think when they get the questions for the video conversation, they probably cannot expect that they will bail out, but let's see what happens. Our experience, I'm not going to get into the details of this, at UNDP, UNICEF and WHO, they don't have an expert. UNICEF, I know myself because I worked there and I knew, so we actually went to meet with the head of child protection, and she said, we haven't yet done anything on Article 33 because we don't have any money. So there exists no expertise in this field at the UN. And then you have an institute that's being cited much in papers, which is UN Special Rapporteur says, especially the UN Special Rapporteur on Health. That is not really somebody inside the UN, but it's an institute set up after 1993 and the Vienna meeting, where they wanted to have in place from civil society and things. And strangely, and I think restrictives has to kind of check themselves on this thing, a succession of legalizers who were active members in legalized organizations were appointed as special rapporteur. One of these was a guy who is also a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, Anand Grover. I'm not going to go into what Anand Grover said, but he basically copied everything I said before about the legalized organizations. And the day after he had reported, he goes to Open Society studio at, I think, 53rd Street on Manhattan, and he's giving a radio interview with Open Society about how it went. So it was more like his reported to his master there, rather than his master was the UN or the Human Rights Conventions. So I'm skipping that one. I'm still green. Wow, okay. So, Committee on the Rights of the Child. Now, if you're going to have human rights treaties, it would be a big loss if you didn't have an independent third party who is checking that you're actually implementing what you have undertaken to implement, that you implemented the minimum standards. And each human rights treaty has their own monitoring body, which is called a committee of that particular instrument. So you have a Committee on the Rights of the Child. State parties are supposed to report to them every 5 years. And early on, I think in 1993, they set up a template for reporting. So Article 33 is, of course, under the heading Special Protection Measures. That is where it was in the beginning. But in 2010, this changed. So then the committee decides to split Article 33. So they put the issue about children's drug use under health instead of being a special protection consideration. And then the other two issues about trafficking and cultivation, they put, it remains there. This is remarkable. This is not really in the mandate of the Committee on the Rights of the Child to start changing the instrument, because this is what they're doing in this case. So anyway, I told you already about Damon Barrett and what he said, that he went to all their meetings and he managed basically to persuade them to recommend harm reduction, even though they didn't know what harm reduction was, in the State Party report to Ukraine. This committee, they have two main products that they're doing. One is called General Conclusions, where they thematically discussing a specific topic. And the other one is Concluding Observation, where it's kind of reacting to the State Party report they just had. So the General Observation is the more important of these two products that they're doing. So far, after 32 years, I think it is, they have never done a general conclusion on Article 33. So they haven't articulated a position on Article 33 yet. So this is where we're standing. So we have a Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is being supported by the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And there is no expertise regarding human rights and drug policy other than the one provided by the legalized organizations. And therefore, they're writing what the legal organizations is saying that we should write. And then finally, the 2019 UN guidelines. I told you about this in the beginning. On human rights and drug policy. So in a side meeting when I was at the CND there, they're presenting these guidelines. So I go there and look at this and I see the cover, it says on one side ICHRDP, International Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy, the legalizer kind of think tank on this thing. On the other side WHO, UNAIDS and UNDP. And I approach all three of them who are at the meeting and I ask, who is your go-to guy regarding human rights and drug policy? Nobody has any of the UN, but they still have put the logos on this thing that obviously ICHRDP has written. And the way these guidelines are written is the following. They follow the ICHRDP logic. You talk about the war on drugs, you claim that harm reduction is the primary human right, you promote any conceivable right. I think they're going through 17 different rights before they're coming to children's rights. And so they have basically buried Article 33 in the very end. It looks like it's the least important thing. And when they're coming there, they have decided that children no longer has a right to protection, but only to information. So they have basically downgraded the right that the CRC is offering children from here to there. You can imagine how it would be among human rights activists if they did the same thing on sexual exploitation, that children have a right to information. The first policy is harm reduction. Can you imagine that? So let's see. One. So, summary conclusion. No human body has an expert in the field of human rights and drugs. The 2019 guidelines for 3 UN agencies makes it explicit that ICRDP is writing the policy for UN, and UN is not willing to be interviewed on the legal analysis that they have made, none of them.